Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly back into a time that's often painted in glowing marble and noble ideals. Ancient Athens, a city of philosophers and poets, of democratic assemblies and marble temples. But not everyone in Athens walked freely beneath the colonnades or spoke their mind in the bustling agora. Some voices were hushed by law, some dreams folded quietly into the dark corners of stone homes. Tonight, we'll gently wander through the daily life of one such soul, a woman born into a world that worshipped beauty but rarely listened to her voice. Before we begin, take a quiet moment to show your support if you're enjoying the stories we share here. A little like or a tap on that subscribe button goes a long way, and I'd truly love to know, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Leave a comment if you feel like it. I read them all, and it always amazes me how this small, sleepy corner of the internet reaches across oceans and time zones. Now turn the lights down low, maybe let a soft breeze hum through a fan, and let's breathe out together. You're here now, and so is the story. The streets of Athens smelled of olive oil and dust, of sun-warmed limestone and the sharp tang of vinegar from stalls that lined the agora. From a high window, tucked behind a thin wool curtain, a woman watched the crowd below. She was not poor, nor was she noble. Her name wouldn't be carved into tablets or spoken in debates. She was simply Callista, daughter of Nicomachos, and this morning, like most, she watched life pass her by from the narrow edge of a world she couldn't fully step into. The room behind her was dim, lit only by the low, flickering light of a clay lamp. The hearth smoked faintly, even in the summer air. Her fingers, still stained with yesterday's dye from boiled herbs and crushed roots, worked slowly over a length of linen. She stitched in silence, as she had every morning since she was old enough to hold a needle. Outside, the sounds of Athens pulsed with the day's rhythm, sandal soles slapping dusty stone, men arguing about grain prices, priests chanting praises to Apollo as sunlight glittered off their robes. But none of that belonged to her. Callista, like most Athenian women, lived half a life, visible only in fragments. She couldn't speak in the assembly. She couldn't walk alone through the market without drawing whispers, or worse. Her thoughts, her opinions, even her laughter belonged behind closed doors. Her world was a mosaic of small tasks and quiet rooms, of managing food stores and weaving cloth, of visiting wells and returning quickly, eyes lowered. Sometimes, when the breeze carried voices up from the street, she would hear boys reciting lines from Homer. Their words, bold and loud, floated past her window like ships she'd never boarded. She knew the stories. She'd heard them from her brother, who had the right to learn them. But for her, knowledge came, through whispers, passed down by older women as they kneaded bread or plucked chickens, half hiding their wisdom behind talk of herbs and home cures. Callista did not question her role, not openly. It wasn't that she lacked courage. It was that questioning left bruises, if not on the skin, then somewhere deeper. In Athens, a woman's silence was a virtue, her obedience a gift. The philosophers debated justice and virtue in the porticos, yet none of them asked what it meant for half the city to live in shadow. And so, the sun moved slowly across the courtyard. The olives swayed gently on the breeze, and inside her quiet, shadowed home, Callista worked and listened and waited. For what? She wasn't quite sure. The needle slipped in and out of the linen with a rhythm that matched the steady hum of cicadas in the late morning heat. Callista's hands moved with practiced ease, yet her mind wandered far beyond the fabric on her lap. She sat cross-legged near the window, her stool worn smooth at the edges from years of use. The air inside the andron, the part of the house where men were forbidden, was close and still, scented faintly with crushed thyme and old olive oil. A single shaft of sunlight filtered through the woven curtain, painting her shoulder in gold and dust. Outside, the city stirred in louder tones now. Merchants called out their wares in the agora. Hooves clacked against cobbled lanes. Somewhere in the distance, a lyre was being plucked with lazy amusement. The scent of roasting fish, tangy with lemon and herbs, wafted in from a neighbor's hearth. Callista closed her eyes for a moment, letting those sounds and smells drift through her like wind through reeds. It was the only way she could leave this place without ever moving. The day stretched before her in a pattern as fixed as the loom in the courtyard. After the linen was hemmed, she would sweep the stone floor, check the amphory in the pantry, and help her younger sister prepare barley for the evening meal. They would crush it with a mortar, grinding it into paste for bread. No feast, no honeyed figs or pomegranates, just the same pale porridge and a few olives. Her brother, Nicandros, might return late from the gymnasium, sweat still clinging to his tunic, speaking of new drills or philosophy he had overheard. Their father would nod at him with slow approval, offering wine and questions. Callista, even if she had wanted to speak, would already be cleaning the cups. It wasn't that her father was cruel. Nikomachos was not a man who raised his voice often. He loved his daughters in his way, but his love was shaped by the world he lived in, a world where a woman's place was behind a screen, her body hidden, her voice softened, her thoughts filtered through duty. From the moment Callista had turned 12, her world had shrunk. Her childhood games beneath the olive trees had faded into hushed chores and heavy expectation. Her laughter, once free in the courtyard, had turned inward, replaced by the quiet sigh of woven threads passing through fingers. Marriage had been spoken of once. A man with a slightly bent nose and a good store of dried fish. Older, widowed. Callista's mother had said little, only pressing her lips tight and folding her arms beneath her apron. But then the man's cousin had taken ill, and the arrangement dissolved like sea foam. Since then, her days had ticked on, each one echoing the last. She had begun to wonder if she was being forgotten, or simply saved for some quieter transaction. Still, there were moments when something in her stirred, a stubborn ember glowing beneath the ash of routine. She had once watched a cat slink across the roof tiles, so free in its movement, so indifferent to the rules that shaped her life. And that night, long after the house had gone still and the lamp had burned low, she had risen and tiptoed out into the courtyard, just to feel the earth beneath her bare feet, just to look up at the stars without being seen. It had felt like trespassing into her own sky. Now, as she worked her needle, her thoughts returned to the girl she had once been. A girl who had once tried to climb the fig tree just to see what lay beyond the garden wall. Her mother had pulled her down with a warning hiss, but not before Callista had caught a glimpse of the Acropolis in the distance, bathed in morning light. That was years ago, but she could still feel the rough bark beneath her palms, the way her heart had leapt, not in fear, but in wonder. The cloth was nearly done. She smoothed the seam and laid it carefully in the basket beside her. From the kitchen came the soft clatter of pottery and her sister's low humming, off-key but sweet. The breeze picked up, carrying in the scent of rosemary from the neighbor's rooftop. For a brief moment, the curtain fluttered wide and sunlight spilled fully into the room, illuminating the threads on her lap, the worn floor beneath her and the quiet strength in her eyes. Then it passed, and the shadows returned, soft and familiar. Callista stood, slowly, stretching her arms until her joints murmured. The silence closed around her again, like an old friend. There was comfort in it, but also a question, one she could not yet shape into words. Not today, but perhaps soon. The sun had risen high by the time Callista stepped into the courtyard, her bare feet brushing over sun-warmed stone. The worn sandals she usually slipped on were left inside, half forgotten in the lull of a quiet afternoon. The central well sat still, a circle of shadow and cool promise. She crossed the courtyard slowly, her fingers grazing the rim as she passed, pausing just long enough to trail her hand over the damp, worn edge. The air here was cooler, caught between the walls, and the scent of stone mixed with the lingering sweetness of grape must from a neighbour's wine press. In the stillness, she felt something stretch inside her, like fabric pulled just slightly too tight, but not yet torn. Her sister Milena sat in the shade, plucking leaves from a stalk of mint, her small fingers moving with more energy than precision. She glanced up when Callista approached, but said nothing, only shifted to make room on the stone bench. They sat together, shoulder to shoulder, the silence between them soft and unhurried. Milena hummed again the same tune from earlier, and this time Callista recognized it. It was the lullaby their mother used to sing when they were small, when the world was just a collection of shadows on the wall and the rustle of straw in the roof was the loudest sound the night offered. Callista closed her eyes. She didn't know if Milena remembered it the same way, but the melody curled around her thoughts and brought back nights when the house felt bigger, filled with voices and candlelight. Before the cold practicality of womanhood began to draw its careful borders. Before curiosity was something to be hidden, and opinions something to swallow. It had all changed so gradually that she hadn't noticed until she was already living within the walls that others had built for her. A door creaked softly from the upper floor. Their mother emerged onto the balcony with a small basket of drying figs. Her eyes swept across the courtyard, and she nodded once before retreating again. She had long since stopped asking Callista to smile. That request had vanished years ago, replaced by shared glances and the silent agreement that pretending wasn't worth the effort. Callista admired her mother in a way she couldn't explain. She had grown up in the same silence, walked the same careful steps, and yet she carried herself like someone who had made peace with the limits of her world. Callista wasn't sure if that was wisdom or surrender. The sharp cry of a gull overhead broke the moment. Callista tilted her head back and followed its path. The bird circled lazily against the pale sky, drifting farther inland than usual. It reminded her of the sea, that great swathe of silver blue she had only seen twice. Once as a child when they visited her uncle's vineyard near Piraeus, and again in secret years later when she had followed her brother and his friends toward the harbour, careful to stay just far enough behind not to be noticed. She had stood alone then, just for a moment, watching the ships move like beetles on the water, their sails pale against the horizon. She remembered thinking how simple it looked to climb aboard and disappear into the wind. Of course, that was not her place. No woman travelled alone. No woman sailed. The sea, like the city, belonged to men. A sharp knock sounded at the front gate, pulling her back into the present. Milena startled beside her, dropping her handful of mint. They both waited, listening. The knock came again, firmer this time, followed by the creak of the gate being opened. Their mother's voice floated down, hushed but firm, and then a man's voice responded low and official. A tax collector, perhaps, or someone from the council. Their father was out, likely visiting the stoa or arguing grain prices with fellow merchants. Callista rose, instinctively brushing her skirt, as she moved toward the edge of the courtyard, not to eavesdrop but to be present. Even if she wasn't allowed to speak, she needed to know. This was how women gathered information after all, not by being told, but by standing quietly at the edges where truth slipped through like wind beneath a door. The conversation didn't last long. The man departed with a polite farewell, and her mother appeared again, basket clutched tightly. She looked tired, not in the way of someone who had walked far, but in the way of someone who carried too many invisible weights. Callista met her eyes and asked nothing. Their mother gave a single brief nod, and that was answer enough. Nothing urgent, nothing to worry about, but still something. Later, as twilight softened the sharp edges of the house and the shadows began to stretch long and familiar, Callista returned to her seat near the window. The needle waited in its basket, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, she watched the light fade across the hills beyond the city, golden, turning to grey. Somewhere, a flute played, hesitant and wandering. She thought of the ships again, and of the sea, and of the doors she had never walked through, the ones she might still, if only in dreams. The evening had folded itself gently around the house, as it always did, wrapping the worn stones and the tired shoulders of its inhabitants in layers of quiet. The courtyard, once humming with heat and voices, had gone still. The sky had softened into a curtain of dusky purple, stars beginning to glimmer faintly, as if unsure whether they were yet welcome. In the center of the hearth, a small fire danced within its clay circle, casting long, flickering shadows up the courtyard walls. The smoke rose slow and spiraled, catching on the faint scent of olive oil and the last stew of lentils simmering in a bronze pot. Callista sat near the warmth, her legs tucked beneath her, not for comfort, but from habit. Milena was beside her again, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear with one hand while twisting a fig stem between her fingers with the other. Their mother stirred the pot, each slow motion of the ladle like a practiced ritual. It was a scene repeated so many times that the walls themselves seemed to remember it. Familiar, quiet, and safe in the way a routine becomes when it is all you have. And yet beneath that comfort, Callista felt a stir. It wasn't discomfort exactly, not a sharp ache, but something quieter and older, a tension that lived deep in her bones like the memory of movement denied. Watching the flames, she thought again of the visitor from earlier that day, the way her mother had returned from the gate holding the basket just a little too tightly. They had not spoken of it again, but Callista knew it would linger in the silence between them. Perhaps the visitor had spoken of new laws or taxes, or another event to be attended by men alone. Perhaps he had simply come to remind them, in his casual presence, of who was allowed to walk freely beneath the stars and who was meant to remain at home, watching firelight crawl up the walls. Dinner was served without ceremony. Wooden bowls, a single spoon passed between sisters. The lentils were thin, flavored with garlic, and the remains of an old turnip. Bread, slightly stale, was torn in pieces and shared without comment. There was no conversation, just the soft scrape of spoon against clay, the occasional sigh from their mother, the quiet hum of night pressing in. When their father returned, he would expect wine and warmth, and the hearth would come alive with questions and answers meant for him. Callista chewed slowly, the food settling in her belly, more like obligation than nourishment. She thought of the women she had seen only glimpses of through the gaps in veils and doors, neighbors whose names she barely knew, whose stories she would likely never hear. Each woman locked in her own pattern of chores and glances and silent evenings. each one a whole world tucked neatly into the corner of a house. When the bowls were cleaned and stacked and the ashes banked, Callista followed the others inside. Their father still had not returned, and the night had deepened into that velvety quiet where every sound is hushed. She moved slowly through the small hallway to the sleeping room, where mats were laid out, and the air smelled faintly of straw and lavender oil. Milena curled beside her quickly, drifting into sleep with the easy peace of someone who still believed that dreams held some kind of promise. Callista lay awake longer, eyes open in the dark, listening to the familiar creaks of wood and the distant bark of dogs outside the city gate. She turned slowly onto her side, feeling the rough weave of the blanket beneath her chin. It was in this hour, when the world had gone still, that her mind began to wander where her feet could not. She imagined herself walking through the agora, not as a shadow trailing behind a father or husband, but as someone who could pause, speak, be seen. She pictured her own sandals scuffing the stones where men argued and traded ideas, her voice joining theirs not as a whisper, but with purpose. Not to debate war or politics, that wasn't her interest, but perhaps to speak of herbs or poetry or the dreams she could not admit to in daylight. These thoughts, half-formed and tender, were not declarations. They were not cries for revolution. They were the quiet kind of rebellion, the kind that lives in the corners of one's mind and waits patiently for some crack in the wall, some small breath of change. She did not believe in sudden miracles. She did not expect her world to bend for her. But even a seed, buried deep and silent, knows how to reach for light when the time comes. Sleep did not find her quickly, but it came eventually, soft and reluctant. Her breath slowed, and her dreams unfolded like cloth slipping from a shelf. Somewhere, in that fragile place between waking and forgetting, she walked through the streets of Athens, her head uncovered, her eyes meeting those who passed. No one stopped her. No one looked away. The morning came softly, wrapped in the grey hush of a sky not yet fully convinced of dawn. Light moved slowly over the tiled roof, trickling down the inner walls of the house like honey, hesitant and sweet. Callista woke, not with urgency, but with the quiet awareness that had followed her through the years. Her body stirred before her thoughts did, stretching out beneath the linen blanket as her eyes blinked against the dim light. Milena, still asleep, breathed slow and deep beside her, one arm curled beneath her cheek like a child too long in a dream. Callista rose with care, pulling her shawl over her shoulders as she stepped out into the hallway. The chill of the stone beneath her feet grounded her in the present, though her dreams still clung faintly to her like cobwebs. She had dreamt of walking again, of voices rising in rhythm around her, not shouting or commanding, but listening. She had spoken in that dream, and no one had turned their head in surprise. There had been no laughter, no furrowed brows, only the quiet nodding of people who recognized her as someone who had something worth saying. But dreams faded quickly in the face of duty. The kitchen fire needed to be rekindled, the water drawn from the well, the bread started. She moved through the routine with a familiarity that dulled thought. The steps were so known they had lost their shape. Each task folded into the next, like verses in a chant recited too many times. The only sound was the low murmur of pigeons on the roof and the occasional creak of the house settling around her. By the time the bread had been set to rise beneath a damp cloth and the oil lamp in the corridor trimmed, her father's footsteps echoed through the outer room. She heard the wooden door shift in its frame and the low scrape of sandals. He coughed once, that same dry bark that signaled both his return and his expectation that things would already be prepared. Callista stepped into view and gave a small nod, her eyes lowered. He barely glanced at her, setting a folded cloth on the table as he moved toward the water basin. She noticed the cloth bore the red stamp of the stoa, and she felt a flicker of curiosity rise, uninvited but persistent. He washed his hands and face in silence, the cool water splashing into the bowl, darkening the stone with soft rings. She waited, quietly attentive, and he finally spoke as he dried his fingers. There was to be a gathering, he said, near the Acropolis. A guest from the islands, a speaker known for stirring words and spirited exchanges. He would go, of course, and Nicandros too, to listen, and perhaps speak, if there was time. Her father's voice held a casual pride, the way it always did when speaking of his son. Callista simply nodded again and asked if he wanted wine. She poured it for him as he sat, her hands steady, her face unreadable. But her thoughts drifted toward the gathering, the speaker, the voices that would rise beneath the shadow of Athena's temple. The thought of it pulled at her like the tide at a loose stone. She could picture it so clearly. Men gathered in loose robes, gesturing with open palms, debating virtue and justice, arguing over the best way to govern or the true meaning of freedom. Ideas hanging in the air like smoke to be inhaled or swept aside. And there she would be, behind a curtain, perhaps catching fragments as she passed with a water jug or a folded cloth. That was the irony of Athens, wasn't it? A city so proud of its democracy, its wisdom, its ideals of freedom. And yet half its people, more than half, were excluded from that vision by birth. Women, slaves, foreigners, all kept on the edges of that bright circle of thought, close enough to hear the warmth, but never touched the flame. Callista knew this not because anyone had told her, but because she had felt it every day of her life. In the way doors were closed gently in front of her, in the way her own brother had once silenced her mid-sentence with a chuckle and a shake of his head, as though her thoughts were a child's drawing beside the mural of his opinions. Still she listened. Always she listened. Women in Athens had long been forced into the role of quiet scholars, absorbing wisdom from between the cracks of conversation. Callista had learned to memorize by rhythm, to read the room without reading a scroll. She knew which neighbor's marriage was unraveling and which merchant's wife was quietly grieving. She could tell when the olives would ripen early, or when the priest at the corner shrine was hiding something beneath his silence. Her knowledge was not written, but lived, carried in her fingers and behind her eyes. As her father sipped the wine and the house slipped further into morning, Callista felt again that subtle ache of wanting. Not for rebellion, not for escape, but for something simpler. A seat near the outer walls of the stoa. A single afternoon in which her ears and her eyes and her voice were not separated by silence. She returned to the courtyard once he had gone, the dust still fresh from his sandals, the warmth of his presence fading. The fig tree rustled above her, its leaves brushing together like whispered words. She sat beneath it, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. Not for change, perhaps, but for the courage to keep listening. The day passed with a slow dignity, like the steady turning of a millstone. By noon, the sky had stretched itself into a canvas of shimmering white, the heat pressing gently against the terracotta walls, wrapping around the courtyard like a thick shawl. Callista moved carefully through the afternoon, her tasks as invisible and expected as breath. She checked the stores of olives in the clay jars, rubbed the dried herbs between her fingers to assess their strength, and swept the inner rooms until the dust settled into soft patterns at her feet. No one noticed. No one remarked. That was the nature of her world. When things were done well, they disappeared. It was in these hours that the city outside seemed to pulse louder, as if it was calling to her from beyond the stone. The hum of conversation drifted through the narrow alleys, punctuated by the clatter of cartwheels and the rhythmic thud of sandal soles on stone. Somewhere, a group of boys chased one another with sticks, their laughter breaking through the haze like birdsong. Callista paused by the window, one hand resting on the ledge, and watched as a plume of dust rose behind their feet. They moved so freely, unbound and loud in a way she never had been. She had played like that once, in the time before the veil and the rules, when scraped knees and sunburned cheeks were badges of childhood and not reminders of transgression. The fig tree stood at the far end of the courtyard, its roots pushing gently at the stones, as if reminding the house that nature still had its say. Callista sat beneath it again, her shawl drawn over her head, though no one could see her. She closed her eyes and listened, not to the sounds outside, but to the ones inside her memory. Her mother's voice reciting recipes, not from scrolls, but from habit. Her grandmother's whispers of old folk tales that never made it into temple carvings, women's wisdom shared in corners and kitchens, passed from hand to hand like bread dough. It was a kind of knowledge no philosopher ever praised, yet it fed the city all the same. She thought then of the gathering her father had mentioned, the orator whose voice would rise among the colonnades, stirring the crowd with ideas of justice and virtue. Callista could almost hear the cadence of that voice, firm but elegant, the kind of voice that believed itself worthy of echo. She imagined the men leaning in, nodding, questioning, laughing, perhaps even changing their minds. It struck her how easily the word of one man could ripple through stone halls and alter the course of thought, while the word of a woman never left the hearth. If she were to speak that way, with clarity and passion, she would be called bold, improper, perhaps even dangerous. The thought did not anger her. It only deepened her stillness. She had never been a loud girl, never one to challenge the rules openly. Her power, if it existed, was of a different kind. She did not seek to shout over the city. She only wished for space to speak within it. A corner of Athens that was not shaped by someone else's design, a space not borrowed or tolerated, but truly her own. Melaina joined her as the sun began to tip westward, her hair still damp from the washing basin. She flopped onto the warm stones with the gracelessness of youth and sighed as if she had just climbed a mountain. Callista smiled, a soft curve of her lips that barely touched the corners of her eyes. Her sister was still young enough to speak freely, though even she was beginning to be reminded when to lower her voice, when to cover her laughter, when to bow her head. It was like watching a flame being slowly coaxed into a lantern, still glowing but no longer wild. They sat together until the light turned golden and the swallows began their evening flight across the rooftops. A pot of barley stew simmered indoors, the scent rising through the courtyard like an old song. Their mother called out, her voice firm but tired, and they both rose without protest. Callista brushed the dust from her skirt, smoothing the fabric with steady hands. Another day folding itself shut like a letter never opened. As night deepened and the stars returned to their careful watch, Callista found herself once again lying on the sleeping mat, her body heavy, but her thoughts still turning. She thought of the garden beyond the city, the one her mother used to describe when she spoke of her own girlhood, a place where fig trees grew wild and bees hummed between the rows of rosemary. She had always imagined that garden not as a place on a map, but as a space in her heart, a quiet rebellion against stone and shadow. A memory that didn't belong to her, yet still felt like home. And perhaps, she thought, as her eyes drifted shut, that was the beginning of something, not change, not yet, but knowing that there was more than the wall in front of her, that beneath the rules and rituals, beneath the chores and silence, there was still a self that dreamed, and that dreaming, even in whispers, was its own kind of strength. The night passed without sound, no footsteps outside the house, no wind rattling the shutters, only the steady breath of sleeping bodies and the muted crackle of a dying hearth. When morning came, it did so gently, as if the sun itself was reluctant to intrude. The light touched Callista's cheek before it touched the stones, soft and warm like a hand brushing against her in comfort. She opened her eyes slowly, as if waking might scare the moment away, and lay still for a long while, listening to the breathing of her sister, the rustle of linen as someone stirred in the next room, and the faint rhythm of her own heart moving quietly beneath her ribs. She rose before the others, stepping silently into the courtyard, where the sky still held the last faint blush of dawn. The fig tree swayed lightly above her, its shadow dappling the stone with patterns that shifted as the breeze passed. The morning smelled of damp clay and crushed mint leaves, and somewhere, beyond the walls, a rooster had begun his second call. She walked barefoot to the well and pulled the rope with steady hands, the water bucket creaking gently as it rose from the cool dark. She poured the water into a shallow basin, splashed her face, and let the cold pull her fully into the day. Her mother appeared soon after, wrapped in a shawl, her mouth already set in the shape of tasks to be completed. They exchanged no words at first, just nods and glances that had replaced conversation long ago. There were lentils to sort and wine to thin, garments to check for mending and firewood to stack. Everything unfolded as expected, each motion tied to the one before it. But that morning, Callista noticed something strange. Her mother moved more slowly, pausing to press her hand against her back when she thought no one was looking. She sighed more often, not with impatience but with weight, and once she sat down mid-task, eyes closed, as if chasing a thought that refused to stay. Callista knelt beside her, reaching for the basket her mother had been sorting. She did not ask what was wrong, that was not their way, but her presence said enough, and the moment passed between them like a breeze beneath a curtain, small but felt. As she worked, Callista let her mind wander again to the gathering her father had attended 2 nights earlier. He had returned late, his voice thick with the excitement of debate and wine, speaking in half-formed quotes and bursts of opinion. He had laughed loudly, declaring the speaker a master of words, a man who could make even the gods stop and listen. Callista had hovered near the doorway, her hands busy with bowls but her ears hungry. She caught phrases between his sips of wine. Justice begins in the home. The soul must be free to speak. The laws of men reflect the minds of men. Words that danced dangerously close to something she had always felt, but never dared to name. Later, when the house had gone quiet and the lamps had burned low, she had repeated those words to herself. Not because they were entirely new, but because hearing them aloud, even second-hand, made something shift inside her. She imagined standing in that crowd, her face lifted to the speaker's voice, not hidden in shadow, but standing plainly in the light. Not agreeing with everything, perhaps, but simply being there, listening as one who belonged. The next afternoon, while running an errand with Melaina, she found herself near the edge of the Agora. The market hummed with life, men shouting prices, donkeys braying, women, those permitted to be there, walking quickly between stalls with baskets balanced against their hips. Callista kept her head low, her shawl drawn tight, but her eyes scanned the edges of the square. There, near the columned steps of a smaller stoa, a few older men sat in discussion, their voices low and deliberate. One of them leaned forward, gesturing with a slow grace, his words weaving into the air like threads. No one noticed her watching. She stood near a wall, pretending to inspect a jar of olives, though she had no intention of buying. The words reached her only in fragments, but that was enough. Enough to remind her that thought was not confined to scrolls or marble halls. That wisdom could be found even here, passed quietly, like a secret, between those who knew how to listen. Milena tugged her arm, reminding her they needed to hurry, and Callista let herself be led away. But as they walked home, she held those words close, as if they were a small stone in her pocket, something solid to touch when the weight of silence grew too heavy. That night, when she returned to the fig tree, she did not sit beneath it. She stood with her back to the trunk and looked up at the sky. The stars had returned, indifferent and ancient. She whispered something then, not a prayer, not quite a thought, but something in between. It was not meant for the gods or the wind. It was meant for herself, a promise made in a voice only she could hear. And the stars, as always, kept their silence. The days that followed slipped past like water over worn stone, soft and almost unnoticed. The rhythms of the household remained the same, morning bread and sweeping, the grind of barley and the scent of thyme curling through the courtyard. Yet something inside Callista had shifted, not enough to be seen from the outside, but enough to make her mornings feel a shade different, as though the sun itself had turned a fraction in its course, just for her. It was not a loud change, not one that drew comment or even glances, but it lived in the way she lingered just a moment longer by the window, or the way she paused mid-task to stare at the sky as if expecting an answer from it. She found herself thinking often of the man by the stoa, his hands drawing thoughts in the air, his voice falling like measured footsteps through the marketplace. Not because he was special, not even because of what he said exactly, but because his words had been allowed to matter. They had been caught, repeated, passed from lips to ears like something of value. It struck her more than ever how many ideas had lived and died in the mouths of women, never written, never remembered. All the thoughts whispered over kneading bowls, all the insights tucked into the edges of lullabies and gossip, all the knowledge carried in the way one woman would glance at another and know what was not being said. That invisible wisdom flowing quietly just beneath the surface of their days. One afternoon, while dusting the storage room, Callista discovered a forgotten jar tucked behind the tall amphorae. It was small, lidded with a cracked piece of wood, and smelled faintly of beeswax and rose oil. Inside it were scraps of cloth, old, yellowed, worn smooth with time, and folded between them a handful of dried leaves and what looked like pressed petals. She lifted one of the cloth pieces carefully, and something tumbled out. A small fragment of parchment, barely longer than her palm, the ink faded but legible. The words were not in her father's hand, nor her brother's. They were curved, thoughtful letters, likely a woman's. She read the lines slowly, sounding them out, under her breath. It was a poem or a prayer. She couldn't be sure. But it spoke of stillness and watching, and the fierce quiet that grows in the hearts of those made to wait too long. She read it 3 times before tucking it carefully back between the folds. Something about the handwriting, the way the letters leaned slightly to one side, as if in motion, made her feel connected to someone she had never known. A woman, perhaps once like her, who had carved out a space between the walls of her life and claimed it for her own. That small jar, dusty and forgotten, had become a room. Not a room with doors or windows, but a place of self. A room built with paper and rose oil, and a will strong enough to believe her thoughts mattered. Callista began to return to it in secret during the quieter hours of the afternoon. She would open the jar, read the lines again, and sometimes add a thought of her own, not in ink, which she did not have, but in whisper. A few words spoken into the fabric as if the cloth could hold them. These were not grand declarations. They were not for anyone else. They were just hers. A line about how the sun looked on the courtyard that morning. A thought about her sister's laughter. A question she hadn't dared to ask aloud. It felt like planting seeds in soil she had never been allowed to touch. She became more attentive in the market as well, listening not just to the stall keepers and their customers, but to the tone beneath their words. She noticed which women spoke freely and which glanced over their shoulders. She saw which boys mimicked their father's swagger and which ones paused when their mothers spoke. She watched the way a girl across the square ran after her little brother, scooping him into her arms with a grace that no one had taught her, but everyone expected. There was a whole language in these moments, a soft, unspoken grammar of care and endurance, of adjustment and resilience. At night, she would lie beneath her blanket and imagine that small room inside her again. She would place each day's observation inside it, gently, as if setting down a shell or a stone. It was becoming full, that space, not cluttered but rich. A garden of quiet truths. No one knew of it. Not her mother, not her sister, certainly not her father or brother, and yet it became the most real part of her. A sanctuary shaped from words never heard and questions never answered. She did not think of this as rebellion. She still obeyed, still cooked and stitched and swept. But something had shifted. She was no longer merely existing within the walls. She was shaping something inside them, not loudly, not with force, but with the careful, patient strength of someone who knows that the greatest truths often grow in silence. The days were growing shorter now, though the air still held the warmth of summer clinging stubbornly to the walls. The sky had begun to mellow into gentler blues, and the wind carried with it the scent of ripening grapes and pressed olives. There was something in the way the light slanted through the courtyard in the late afternoon that reminded Callista of the endings of things. Not sorrow exactly, but a kind of closing. As if the world, in its quiet language, was whispering that this season, this particular shape of time, was slowly being folded away. Callista felt the shift in her bones before she could put it into words. There were no changes in the household to mark it. Her father still left before dawn and returned long after dusk. Her mother still moved with that same steady pace, and Milena still laughed too loudly when she thought no one would scold her. But for Callista, the air seemed to carry an echo now, as if every moment came with a reflection, not just of what was, but of what could have been. The jar remained hidden in the storage room, tucked carefully behind the tall amphorae. Each day, she found a moment to return to it, even if just for a heartbeat. She no longer whispered aloud. Instead, she began to shape words in her mind, phrases that wrapped around her tasks, turning the simplest duties into small acts of thought. She imagined herself as a scribe with no scroll, a philosopher with no audience. But in the quiet, within the hush of that forgotten room, she was both author and reader. She crafted reflections in the rhythm of her sweeping, composed questions in the stitching of a torn tunic, and hid metaphors within the slicing of onions. No one could see it, but her world had become layered. Each action held a second meaning, and each moment was shared between her body and her mind. One morning, after a night of wind and dry leaves scattering across the rooftops, Callista awoke with a line repeating in her mind. It had no source, no memory attached to it, just a simple phrase that seemed to emerge from the folds of sleep like mist from a river. She kept it close all day, repeating it silently as she folded linen and poured water into clay cups. She knew the line would fade, like many others had, but the act of remembering, of holding it within her like a small flame, brought her a kind of strength she had never learned to name. Her mother had begun to notice something too. Not in words, never in direct question, but in the way she looked at Callista when they shared the quiet work of evening. There was a certain depth in her gaze, as though she recognized that something unspoken was blooming inside her daughter. Perhaps she even understood it. After all, her mother had once been a girl too, a girl with thoughts that had no place to rest, with questions that hung unasked in the corners of the house. Maybe she had found her own jar once. Maybe it had been buried, broken, or simply forgotten over the years. But the look in her eyes when she glanced at Callista now held something like recognition, a softness that suggested she remembered what it was like to carry a self quietly inside another life. It was on one such evening that they sat together by the hearth, their hands busy with peeling vegetables, the silence between them familiar and undemanding. The fire cracked gently, and the scent of onion and garlic clung to the air. Without turning her head, Callista spoke softly. "Did you ever want to do something that wasn't meant for you?" The question landed lightly, without weight, as though it had simply wandered into the room on its own. Her mother didn't answer right away. She set the knife down, wiped her hands slowly on her apron, and stared into the fire. The silence stretched, not awkward, but deliberate. Finally, she said, "Once. I was very young. I wanted to sing in the temple chorus." Her voice held no bitterness, only memory. "But I was too plain," they said, "and too quiet." Callista nodded, not pressing. That was all her mother chose to share, and it was enough. In that brief moment, something shifted between them. Not drastically, but like a door being left slightly ajar. They returned to their task, the rhythm of their hands resuming as before. But the room felt different, warmer, more open, as if the fire had begun to glow just a little brighter. That night, as Callista lay beneath her blanket, the stars overhead tracing slow arcs beyond the roof tiles, she thought of her mother's words. She imagined the young girl her mother had been, standing outside the temple gates, ears filled with song she was not allowed to join. She thought of how that small ache must have woven itself into every loaf of bread, every folded tunic, every story told over a bowl of lentils. And she realized then that her own small jar, her hidden garden of thought, was not just for herself. It was part of something larger, something shared. A quiet inheritance passed down, not in gold or property, but in the courage to dream while kneeling beside a hearth. The days fell into their usual pattern again, but for Callista, the sense of familiarity now held something deeper than routine. It was as if her world, once a single, flat plane of duties and silence, had slowly unfolded into layers. She had begun to see her life not only in the steps she took or the tasks she performed, but in the echoes behind them. There was meaning even in the small things. The grain in the bread she kneaded each morning carried the rhythm of women long before her. The stone basin where she washed lentils had been smoothed by decades of hands, perhaps once even the hands of someone who had whispered their thoughts into the cool splash of water, just as she did now. Her mother didn't speak again of the temple chorus, but she didn't need to. Something in her manner had shifted. She moved through the house with the same steady grace as before, yet there was a softness to the way she lingered near Callista when they worked together, the way her hand would brush lightly over her daughter's shoulder without purpose, a quiet kind of reaching. It wasn't affection as some would expect it. It was a sharing of space, of presence, a language of closeness that needed no words. Callista, in turn, had begun to find new ways to weave her thoughts into the day. She would repeat words in her mind while stirring the cooking pot, or while hanging linen to dry in the open courtyard. One afternoon, she found herself speaking softly to the olives in the basket, telling them of a dream she'd had the night before, where she wandered through the academy, scrolls tucked beneath her arm, not as a servant, but as a student. No one laughed or turned her away. She sat among them not as a curiosity, but as an equal. The dream had stayed with her, clearer than others, and telling it aloud, even to olives, gave it shape. Melina remained unaware of the deeper current running beneath the stillness of their home. She was younger, still caught in that space between girlhood and the world's awakening demands. Her laughter was still full and unguarded, her steps quick, her questions many. Callista sometimes watched her with a strange mixture of envy and tenderness, that freedom, unshaped by the walls yet, would not last forever. It would narrow in time, as it had for every woman before her. But for now, Callista allowed it to live undisturbed, even joined in Melina's stories, letting her younger sister paint wild tales of sea gods and river nymphs while they shelled beans at the kitchen bench. One cool evening, the family gathered earlier than usual in the courtyard. A breeze had stirred from the hills, softening the heat that clung to the walls. Their father was in good spirits, having returned from a gathering where a visiting scholar had praised the city's governance with such flair that even the older men had stayed long past sunset. Nicandros was animated as he described the gathering, recounting each phrase with the confidence of someone who believed the city belonged to him by right of birth and education. Their mother served wine in small clay cups, her movements quiet but sure, and Callista sat slightly back from the fire, her hands folded in her lap. As the night wore on and the moon began its slow climb, their father turned to Callista, perhaps struck by a rare mood of inclusiveness, and asked her what she thought of a comment Nicandros had just made about order and obedience. The question came lightly, without expectation, perhaps as one might ask a child what she thinks of the stars, not to hear truth, but to be amused. Callista looked at him calmly, the firelight catching in her eyes. She answered with a careful phrase she had once heard near the Stoa, something about order meaning little without understanding, and obedience meaning nothing without consent. Her voice was low, measured, but steady. The moment hung in the air, more for its rarity than for what she had said. Nicandros raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Their father chuckled, not mockingly, but with the puzzled curiosity of someone who had found a coin in his pocket he didn't remember placing there. He nodded once and looked away. The conversation moved on, but for Callista, that small moment lingered. It was not victory, it was not even approval, but it was space. A space she had not been given before, a space she had made for herself. She tucked it away inside her, added it to the room, behind the amphorae, and the whispered words in the garden of her mind. It was not loud, and it was not lasting, but it was hers. Later that night, she stood by the fig tree again, watching the leaves shift against the sky. Her shadow stretched long behind her, soft and shapeless. She reached out and touched the trunk, her fingers brushing the bark, like pages she could not yet read. She was beginning to understand that the voice she carried, quiet as it was, mattered. And if no one else would make space for it, she would make it herself. The morning after the courtyard conversation arrived, with a lightness Callista had not expected. The sky was swept clear, its blue unmarred and deep like polished stone, and the air carried the faint scent of rosemary from the neighbor's yard. There was something different in the way she moved through her tasks. Not haste, not excitement, but a softened calm, as though some small knot inside her had quietly loosened in the night. The weight of years hadn't lifted, not completely, but something had shifted in its place. She felt her breath deeper in her chest, her steps more rooted. The world was still the same, but she was beginning to inhabit it differently. She stirred the morning porridge with her usual focus, watching the grains swirl in the pot, and found herself humming softly, a tune she barely remembered. It came unbidden, perhaps something from her earliest years, before she was taught which sounds were welcome in a woman's mouth and which ones were not. The melody felt round and low, like the kind sung to sleeping babies or whispered into a night wind. Her mother, seated nearby, trimming stems from a bundle of dill, glanced up but said nothing. Her mouth curved slightly at the corners, the kind of expression one makes when recognizing a moment but choosing not to name it. The morning unfolded in quiet simplicity. Milena was gone to help an older cousin in the next street, leaving Callista and her mother to the gentle rhythm of two women moving through a shared space. It was on such days that time moved like thread through cloth, slow and steady. Callista fetched water, swept the courtyard again, and spent part of the afternoon mending one of her father's tunics, the linen worn thin under the arms. Her needle moved in small, deliberate stitches, the fabric warming in her lap as she worked beneath the filtered light. It was during this time that she began to wonder, in the way thoughts gently unspool without warning, what it might be like to record her days not only in memory, but in form. She had no scrolls and no ink, but she had cloth, she had her needle. And perhaps she thought perhaps that was enough, not to write stories, not exactly, but to mark them. To stitch a line that meant, "Today the air was full of birdsong," or "My mother spoke of dreams." She imagined a length of fabric, ordinary to any other eye, but rich with meaning only she would understand. A private language of thread and gesture. That idea held her gently for the rest of the day, sitting just beneath her other thoughts like a current beneath still water. She returned to it while kneading the afternoon bread, pressing rhythm into the dough with each fold. She revisited it again as she rinsed lentils in the basin, watching them slip between her fingers like tiny golden stones. Even as the evening settled around the household, its soft shadows reaching into the corners of the room, the thought remained. She hadn't spoken it aloud, not even to herself, but it lived there now, taking root. That evening, her father did not return for supper. Word came through a neighbor that he had remained at the Stoa, caught up in a long discourse between merchants and jurists about some new interpretation of civic obligation. Her mother had nodded at the news, unsurprised, and served the stew without comment. It was quiet at the table, with only the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of spoons against clay. Milena recounted her afternoon with their cousin, pausing now and then for dramatic effect, her voice rising and falling like a young actress still learning her stage. Callista listened with a smile, her thoughts drifting between her sister's laughter and the imagined weight of a needle in her hand, threading meaning into cloth. When the meal was done and the bowls cleaned, she returned to the courtyard. The fig tree stood as always, a sentinel in the deepening dark. She didn't go to the storage room that night. Instead, she brought with her a scrap of unused linen, frayed at the edges but still whole. She sat near the tree, her back pressed to its rough bark, and held the fabric in her lap. The stars had begun their quiet bloom above, and the wind was slow and low, like a sleeping breath across the rooftops. She threaded her needle carefully, knotting the end as she had done hundreds of times before, but this time with a different purpose. Her hands moved slowly, not in patterns of mending but in intention, a few small stitches, a change in direction, a loop. To anyone else it would look like little more than clumsy embroidery, but to her, each stitch marked a moment, a feeling, a truth, not a loud voice. It was not about beauty, it was about preservation, a way to speak without being heard, to remember without asking permission. As she stitched, the night grew deeper around her, folding gently over the house. The wind shifted the leaves above her head, and in the darkness she smiled. For the first time, she felt she was writing her story, not in scrolls or in public records, but here, in thread and shadow, and the memory of her own hands. The city might never know her name, the orators might never echo her words, but still she was leaving something behind. The following morning arrived as it always did, without fanfare. The sun was soft at first, hesitant behind a veil of thin clouds, and the air hung low and cool over the courtyard. The house stirred slowly. Milena mumbled something in her sleep and turned over, pulling the edge of the blanket beneath her chin. Their mother moved with quiet discipline, already halfway through her early chores before the birds finished their first song. But for Callista, waking was different that day. She lay still for several moments, her body curled gently beneath the linen, her mind resting in that space between dream and thought. Her hands ached faintly, not from labor, but from purpose. From the thread she had drawn through fabric beneath the fig tree, from the marks she had made that no one else would recognize, and yet which felt more like her than anything else in the house. The cloth she had stitched still lay folded in the crook of her robe, tucked safely beneath the reed mat where she had slipped it the night before. She thought of it often throughout the day, not with worry, but with a quiet, persistent joy. There was a power in knowing she had created something entirely her own. It wasn't grand or loud, and it changed nothing in the world around her. The street still bustled with men debating over trade and taxes. Her brother still looked through her more often than at her, and the city's stone heart still beat to the rhythm of voices she was never meant to join. But she had marked her presence. She had stitched herself into a corner of the world, however small. Later that afternoon, while her mother prepared the evening stew and Milena tried unsuccessfully to thread a needle for her own modest mending, Callista was asked to take a small parcel to an older woman who lived 3 houses down. The request came simply with a brief gesture and a nod, and Callista accepted it with the quiet efficiency expected of her. She wrapped the parcel in cloth and stepped into the narrow alley behind their home, her sandals brushing against dry leaves scattered in the breeze. The city outside the home always felt both familiar and distant. She knew the paths by heart, the slope of the stones, the way sunlight struck the eastern walls before noon. But it never quite felt like hers. It was a place observed, not inhabited. And yet today, as she walked beneath the stretched shadows of hanging grapevines and past the scent of lemon balm from a neighbor's window, she felt different. Not bolder, not freer, but more aware of herself within it all. She carried her thoughts like another layer of clothing, invisible to others, but warming her just the same. The woman she visited, Theano, was nearing 60 and had once been the midwife for half the women in their part of the city. Her eyes were sharp even if her knees were weak, and her home smelled of bay leaves and old papyrus. When Callista entered, Theano greeted her not with softness, but with an appraising look, one that seemed to weigh more than just the parcel in her hand. She accepted the cloth bundle, then gestured for Callista to sit for a moment while she arranged it on a low table. It was not a request, nor was it quite a command. It was the kind of invitation older women offered when they wished to speak but didn't wish to explain why. Callista sat. "You've changed," Theano said after a moment, not unkindly, not with accusation. She stirred a bowl of herbs with a wooden spoon, eyes on her work. "Not in your face, but in the way you breathe." Callista said nothing, unsure how to respond, but a strange warmth flushed through her chest. Theano had always spoken plainly. Some found it rude, others found it frightening. Callista found it comforting, like being acknowledged in a world that so often looked away. "I see it sometimes," the old woman continued, "in girls who begin to think with both heart and mind. It's a dangerous thing." She paused and turned to look at Callista directly. "And a necessary one." Still, Callista didn't speak. She only nodded once, a gesture that said, "I hear you, even if I don't know how to answer." Theano smiled slightly, the lines around her mouth softening. "We used to carve thoughts into clay back when I was young. Nothing special, just small ones, symbols mostly. We hid them in the walls of the courtyard, under the stones. None are left now. The house has been rebuilt too many times, but I remember them. The act of it, the shape of saying something even if no one hears." When Callista finally rose to leave, she carried those words with her as carefully as she had carried the parcel. Back home, she placed her sandals by the door, washed her hands, and returned to her chores. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. That night, she pulled the cloth from its hiding place and began another line of stitches. This time, not just for herself, but in silent memory of every woman who had ever spoken without being heard, written without ink, dreamed without witness. The needle moved with ease through the fabric, and beneath her breath she whispered what she could not say aloud. The wind changed the next morning. It came from the north, brushing down the narrow streets with a crispness that stirred the dust from the corners and sent small leaves tumbling along the path like children at play. Callista felt it as she stepped into the courtyard, her hair lifting ever so slightly beneath her shawl, her arms touched by that gentle chill. The sun was warm still, but the wind whispered of the coming turn in the season. She closed her eyes for a moment and simply stood there, the way one stands at a doorway, not yet inside or outside, just balanced between the two. There was a strange kind of stillness in her lately, not born from peace but from presence. A deep awareness of where she stood in her own skin, in her own thought. She carried water from the well with more ease now, not because the task had grown lighter, but because her thoughts moved through it differently. What once had been burden was now part of a rhythm she understood. Her fingers moved automatically as she swept the corridor, as she trimmed dried herbs, as she folded the same garments that had passed through 100 washings. Yet within that repetition lived a kind of intention, a softness, a kind of care that felt almost like prayer, though she'd never been taught to call it that. The cloth she had begun stitching now held more than she expected. At night, she added to it, never in patterns or practiced designs, just lines and knots that meant something only to her. A swirl for a conversation she wanted to remember. A jagged edge for the ache in her chest that sometimes arrived without cause. a small loop for Melena's laughter echoing through the house earlier that afternoon. Each thread captured a breath of the day and folded it into memory. It was not meant for beauty. It was meant for truth. One evening, while the others sat gathered near the fire, Callista remained a little apart, perched near the doorway, where the cool air slipped through and brushed against her cheeks. She held the cloth in her lap and her needle poised, but she did not stitch. She simply watched. Her father was telling some tale from the marketplace, the kind that carried more pride than detail, and Nikandros nodded along, amused but not deeply interested. Her mother sat in quiet attention, her hands resting in her lap, and Melena leaned against her shoulder, sleepy from the day's errands. There was comfort in watching them. They were the same people they had always been, yet Callista saw them differently now, not as obstacles or as parts of her confinement, but as shapes in the fabric of her life. They moved according to the laws of their world, each one holding burdens they would never speak of aloud. Even her father, stern and certain, carried his role with a kind of heaviness. She saw it now in his shoulders, in the pause before he spoke, in the lines deepening at the corners of his mouth. He was a man shaped by expectation, just as she was a woman shaped by silence. Later, when the house had grown still and the coals glowed low, she returned to the fig tree. She held the cloth close to her chest and looked up at the branches, at the way they reached and curved, as if listening to something deep within the sky. The stars shimmered quietly, not in patterns but in patience. And she thought of Theano's words, of clay symbols tucked into walls, of memories hidden beneath stones. There were so many stories that would never be told, so many voices that would dissolve into dust without ever being heard. And yet here she was, one woman among many, choosing to remember. That night, she stitched a single line from one end of the cloth to the other. Straight, steady, without ornament. It wasn't meant to mean anything in particular, but somehow, in its simplicity, it felt more important than all the others. It marked not a moment, but a knowing, a kind of understanding that could not be named, only felt. She tied the final knot gently, her fingers trembling, not with fatigue, but with something deeper. She was no longer simply reacting to the life she had been given. She was shaping it, quietly, invisibly, but shaping it nonetheless. As she tucked the cloth beneath her mat and lay down to rest, her thoughts drifted like leaves in a quiet stream. She imagined generations of women before her, stitching their truths into fabric or clay or song. She imagined them standing beneath their own fig trees, whispering their names into the night. And she felt, for the first time, that she was not alone in her silence. There were mornings when the world seemed to speak louder than usual, even without saying anything at all. Callista noticed it in the way the birds began their song earlier, in the way the clay beneath her sandals seemed warmer, more alert. It wasn't that the city had changed. The streets still wound their way through worn stone and scattered markets. The same voices filled the air with familiar demands and disputes, and the same expectations pressed against the spine of every woman who stepped outside her door. But within her, something had shifted. She moved through her day with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to listen, not just to others, but to herself. That morning, she found herself drawn to the edge of the courtyard, where the older fig tree leaned slightly into the light, its branches sagging with the weight of ripening fruit. The leaves shimmered as the breeze passed through, whispering secrets to one another. Callista ran her hand gently along the bark. It felt coarse, weathered, but alive. She crouched beside it, brushing away a cluster of dry leaves at its base, and for no reason at all began to smooth the earth with her fingers. She didn't know what she was looking for. Maybe nothing. Maybe just the feel of cool soil beneath her skin reminded her that she belonged to something older and more patient than any rule ever spoken aloud. Her chores called her back, of course, as they always did. Life in the house did not pause for the thoughts of young women. But even as she swept and boiled lentils, as she listened to her mother discuss bread ratios with a neighbor and mended a frayed hem on Nicandros's tunic, her mind carried the morning with it like a warm stone in the pocket of her thoughts. Her fingers moved with ease, her attention flickered between tasks, yet something inside her remained still. She was beginning to understand that her silence was not emptiness, it was space. And within it, she could hold 100 thoughts, each one carefully nested inside the next, like figs growing under the same leaf. That evening, as dusk softened the corners of the house and the shadows grew longer in the courtyard, Callista returned to her quiet work. She had begun adding more to her stitched cloth. Not just lines and patterns, but small shapes now. A curve that reminded her of the archway near the agora. A spiral that echoed the way her mother's voice moved when she told stories of her girlhood. None of it would be understood by anyone else, and that was the point. This was not a letter to be read. It was a room without a door, built stitch by stitch for no one but herself. As she worked, Milena drifted into the courtyard, barefoot, and still humming the half-finished song she'd been obsessed with all week. She flopped down beside Callista and watched her in silence for a while, her chin resting on her knees. "What is that?" she asked eventually, her voice drowsy but curious. Callista hesitated. Then, without looking up, she replied, "Just something I'm making." A cloth. Milena leaned closer. "It looks strange." Callista smiled softly. "It's not meant to look like anything." Milena tilted her head, considering this. "Then what's it for?" Callista looked up then, her eyes meeting her sister's. She thought of Theano's clay symbols, of her mother's untold dreams, of all the words that had been swallowed for generations. "It's for remembering," she said. Milena blinked, then nodded as if that made perfect sense. She lay back on the warm stones and stared at the slowly darkening sky, her little feet twitching now and then. They stayed like that for some time, the two of them in stillness, the cloth between them, the stars just beginning to peek through the twilight veil. Later that night, after Milena had fallen asleep and the house settled into the hush of sleeping breaths, Callista found herself back at the fig tree, cloth folded neatly in her lap. She didn't stitch right away, she only sat there, listening. The wind stirred the leaves gently. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The stars blinked overhead, each one holding its place. She remembered then a passage her father once quoted from a poet, one she wasn't supposed to hear. It had been meant for her brother, offered during a lesson that drifted into the courtyard like smoke. The poet spoke of truth, living not in loud declarations, but in the silence between the stones. At the time, she hadn't understood it. But now, sitting here, in the quiet company of her own thoughts, she felt its weight. She began to stitch again, slowly, carefully. Not out of need, but out of presence. Each thread another step in a journey that only she could walk. A quiet resistance, a soft defiance. Not against her family, not even against her city, but against the forgetting. Against the idea that what could not be spoken should not be kept. Her cloth was her answer, her memory, her echo. And in that moment, beneath the fig tree and beneath the stars, she no longer felt as though she were only surviving her silence. She was beginning to shape it, The days that followed moved as they always had, each one stitched to the next, like patches in a well-worn robe. But Callista was beginning to sense the space between them, the delicate thread that linked one moment to another, not through time, but through feeling. She still performed her tasks with the same steadiness, drawing water in the early light, smoothing the linen over the washing stones, preparing barley in measured handfuls, but each act carried within it a softness, as though her own breath had begun to live inside her work. She didn't speak of the cloth to anyone else. Milena, in her curiosity, had already forgotten the conversation in the courtyard, her mind now flitting between stories and errands, her thoughts as restless and changeable as the breeze. Their mother asked no questions, and Callista felt grateful for that. There was something sacred about keeping it unspoken, not secret, but whole, like a river running beneath the earth, carving its path without needing to be seen. That evening, while shelling fava beans with her mother, Callista let her eyes wander toward the doorway. Beyond it, the light had taken on that honeyed glow that came just before sunset, when the walls seemed to soften and shadows lengthened like lazy cats. Her mother's hands moved deftly, as they always did, snapping the pods open with a practiced twist. Callista's fingers mirrored the movement, but her mind was far from the basin. She thought of the fig tree, of the lines she had stitched the night before, and of the way her cloth was beginning to resemble something like a map. Not of a place, but of a life. Her life. "Your hands are gentler now," her mother said suddenly, not looking up. Callista blinked. "Are they?" Her mother nodded. "You used to rush the beans, snap them too sharply. Now you hold them like they're meant to be kept whole." Callista didn't answer right away. Her eyes returned to the pods in her lap. She felt the skin beneath her fingers, the slight give before they split. She hadn't noticed the change, but perhaps that was what made it real. Not something practiced, but something that had simply grown into her. That night, she waited until the house had gone still before slipping out to the courtyard. The moon was half hidden behind a veil of clouds, and the stars blinked uncertainly above the tiled roofs. The fig tree, faithful and old, waited without question. She sat beneath it, the cloth in her lap, and for a long moment did nothing but breathe. The air was cool, touched with the scent of olive wood smoke drifting from a distant hearth. She closed her eyes and listened, not for anything in particular, but for the way the night settled around her. When she began stitching, her hands moved slowly, not from fatigue, but from care. Tonight, she wasn't recording thoughts, she was listening for them, feeling them rise from the stillness like steam from warm stone. A spiral formed beneath her, needle coiling into itself. It reminded her of the way her thoughts returned again and again to the same place, not circling in confusion, but in deepening, as though understanding came not from moving forward, but from returning, from staying. She paused after a while, her fingers resting on the fabric, and looked up toward the stars. Somewhere, men were likely still gathered in heated debate, voices raised in the halls of the stoa, theories tossed like coins across marble floors. And yet, here she was, stitching truths no one would hear, and feeling them settle deeper into her than any lecture ever could. She didn't resent them, not the men, not even her brother, who would never think to ask her what she believed about virtue or justice. They were only repeating what had been given to them, just as she was choosing to shape what had been given to her. A gentle step on the stones behind her made her turn. It was her mother, wrapped in a thin shawl, her hair loose at her shoulders, something rare and intimate about her appearance in that light. "I thought I might find you here," she said quietly. Callista didn't speak. She folded the cloth gently and set it beside her, making room. Her mother sat slowly, with the careful ease of someone who had earned her right to silence. For a time, they said nothing. The night curved around them, holding them as the stars shifted in their slow turning. Then her mother asked, "Do you ever feel like your thoughts are too loud for your own mind?" Callista looked at her, surprised not by the question, but by the familiarity of it. She nodded. "I used to feel that way," her mother continued, "when I was your age. I tried to write once, not letters, just lines. But I had no paper, and it felt foolish to ask." "What did you do with them?" Callista asked softly. Her mother smiled faintly. "I said them to the bread while it rose." The thought settled into Callista like warm water. Two women, mother and daughter, separated by years but joined in silence, shaping their truths into the things they touched every day. Not to be remembered by others, but to remember themselves. They sat together a little longer, the cloth resting between them, not quite hidden anymore. The fig leaves rustled gently overhead, and somewhere beyond the city walls a dog gave a single bark before falling quiet again. The world turned slowly, as it always did. But in that small corner of it, beneath a tree older than either of them, two women sat with a shared breath and a thread of understanding. By morning, the air carried a coolness that crept through the shutters and traced its fingers along the walls, wrapping gently around the clay jars and empty baskets in the corners. The house was slow to stir, and Callista awoke before the first sounds of the city reached their windows. She remained in her blanket for a while, eyes open, listening to the quiet. It was not the kind of silence that asked to be filled, but one that seemed content to exist just as it was, and she let herself rest within it, her thoughts not yet tethered to the chores awaiting her hands. The memory of the night before lingered like warmth on her skin. Her mother, sitting beneath the fig tree beside her, sharing that quiet truth about speaking to the bread. Something so small and yet profound in the way it revealed a life lived beneath the surface. It had felt like being handed a key to a room she hadn't known her mother also carried, a space carved gently from years of patience, of unspoken hopes, of silent resilience. That room, Callista realized, had always been there, just not spoken of. And now that she had seen it, the way it existed quietly inside another woman, it changed the shape of her world once again. When she rose, the cloth was still folded neatly at the base of the fig tree. She brought it inside and tucked it carefully beneath her tunic before beginning her morning tasks. The day unfolded in usual fashion, water fetched, herbs gathered, bread set to rise, and yet she moved through it with a sense of shared presence, as if her hands were now part of something larger, a lineage not marked in scrolls or marble statues, but in the bending of bodies over bread and the long patience of stitching quiet truths into plain fabric. Later that day, as the sun stood high and the shadows curled short beneath the benches, Callista and her mother worked side by side in the rear courtyard, scraping and cleaning the flat stones where olives would soon be pressed. The work was messy and required more strength than many realized, and yet they moved through it without much need for words. Every now and then, her mother would hum softly, a tune that seemed to float just above the rhythm of her sweeping. Callista didn't recognize the melody, but it felt familiar in the way a scent can recall a place you've never been. It was not joyous, nor was it mournful. It was simply present, like the light on the stone or the dust in the air. As they paused for water, her mother looked over and asked gently, "Do you ever wonder if it's enough?" Callista tilted her head, unsure what she meant. This, her mother said, gesturing with a damp cloth toward the olive press and the work of their hands. All of it, the stitching, the quiet keeping. Does it ever feel, small? The question lingered between them, not accusatory, but honest. Callista thought for a moment, then answered slowly. Sometimes, but I think it's not about size. It's about being real. Some things don't need to be loud, to be strong. Her mother looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. Not broadly, but with the kind of smile that settles deep into the skin, a recognition more than approval. "You sound older than you are," she said softly. "I feel older than I should," Callista replied. They shared a quiet laugh, one not filled with humor exactly, but with the soft relief of being understood. And, in that moment, the courtyard, with its cracked stones and half-cleaned basin, became something else entirely. It became a place of acknowledgement, of mutual knowing. A simple space reshaped by the presence of two women who had both chosen to carry more than they could ever name aloud. That night, under a moon fuller than it had been in days, Callista returned to her cloth once more. She stitched slowly, letting the rhythm of the needle match the memory of her mother's hum. Each thread was a line from the day, a record not of events but of feeling. A curved line for the conversation, a double stitch for the sound of water over stone, a short row of knots for the question her mother had asked. It was all there, written in a language no one else would understand, and yet more complete than any scroll or speech could ever be. And as she stitched, she realized that something had changed, not just in her or her mother, but in the quiet agreement that now lived between them. It wasn't spoken, it didn't need to be, but it was present, like the scent of time in the late summer wind, or the way the fig tree leaned toward the morning light. They had made space for each other, not by breaking rules or demanding more, but by recognizing that what they carried in silence was no less worthy of memory. When the cloth was folded, and the house again settled into sleep, Callista lay down with a strange sense of calm. She no longer felt quite so hidden, quite so separate from the voices that filled the city each day. She had found another voice, older than parchment, softer than stone. A voice stitched not in defiance, but in memory. A voice she would keep. The clay bowl slipped from her hands just as the midday light began to shift, falling not with a dramatic crash but with a dull, heavy crack against the floor. The sound cut through the drowsy quiet of the afternoon like a sudden gust, and for a heartbeat, everything in the kitchen paused. Callista stared at the pieces scattered around her feet, the broken bowl resting in halves like a story no longer whole. She didn't cry out or flinch. She simply knelt down, gently gathering the fragments, her fingertips tracing the edges with the same care she gave to her cloth. Some breaks, she knew, were not signs of carelessness, but signs of time, of thin, worn days that eventually give way to gravity. Her mother came to the doorway just then, wiping her hands on a corner of her apron. She looked at the floor, then at Callista, her expression unreadable at first. But instead of a scolding, she only sighed lightly and said, "It was old." The words hung in the air like the scent of time in a stew, faint, grounding, and enough. Together they swept up the pieces, dropping them into the clay jar kept in the corner for waste too fine to reuse but too familiar to forget. Afterward, Callista returned to her task, stirring lentils in the pot with one hand, while the other rested absently against the worn stone ledge. Her mind was still caught on the moment the bowl had slipped, how small a thing it seemed, and yet how clearly it had echoed. She didn't know why it lingered in her thoughts, perhaps because something about the sound of breaking felt oddly honest, Not dramatic or cruel, but true, like a reminder that even in the quietest lives there are small fractures. And sometimes those are the moments that let the light in. That evening, she walked a little further than usual, taking the long way around the outer edge of the neighborhood as she fetched a bundle of dried lavender from a relative's home. The sun was lower than she expected, the streets already touched by that sleepy, golden hush that came before evening fully declared itself. A few women sat outside their doors, hands busy with weaving or shelling peas, heads tilted together in shared conversation that broke off into soft laughter and pauses too deep to be anything but knowing. Callista nodded politely as she passed, and the women smiled, not kindly or dismissively, but in that small way women do when they recognize each other's place in the same quiet rhythm. When she returned home, the smell of baking bread filled the courtyard, earthy and warm. Her mother's voice floated from the kitchen, softly humming again, and Milena was chasing a chicken across the garden path, her feet bare and hair flying behind her. There was something timeless in the moment, as if it could have belonged to any year, any generation, any set of hands. And Callista, for all her thoughts and stitchings and inward reflections, felt herself folded into it like a page, slipped gently into a well-worn book. Later that night, once the chickens had settled and the hearth coals had dimmed to a sleepy red glow, she sat beneath the fig tree again. The cloth now had weight, not from thickness, but from memory. Each mark was a day, each stitch a word she had never said aloud. She ran her fingers across the latest row, a winding curve she'd added in the afternoon after the bowl had broken. It wasn't meant to represent the bowl exactly, but the sound, the feel of it leaving her hand, the way it had opened something in her chest that hadn't quite closed again. She threaded her needle and began a new section. No shapes this time. Just small, even stitches rising and falling like the sound of a sleeping breath. She didn't know what they meant yet. She only knew that they needed to be there, that her hands understood something her mind hadn't yet formed into thought. This was how she had come to understand herself, not in declarations or decisions, but in this soft work, in the giving of form to feelings she couldn't name. When her mother joined her again beneath the tree, there was no need for greeting. They simply sat. Two figures in the night, bound not by talk, but by presence. After a long moment, her mother said, "The bowl you dropped today, I remember when we bought it. You were still too small to speak properly." Callista smiled, her needle pausing mid-thread. "I remember the stall," her mother continued. "The merchant tried to charge too much, and your father argued for 10 minutes over a single drachma." She chuckled softly. "I hated that bowl then, but now it feels like it's been with us forever." Callista looked down at the cloth in her lap. "I kept a piece," she admitted. Her mother turned slightly toward her. "Why?" "I don't know," Callista said, truthfully. "It just felt like part of something." Her mother nodded slowly, not asking to see it, not questioning the instinct. "We all keep pieces," she said, her voice low and even. "Even when we pretend not to." They sat there as the stars filled in the sky above them, the world folding gently into itself. And beneath the fig tree, with her cloth in hand and her mother beside her, Callista stitched one more line into the story of her quiet resistance, her careful remembering. The next morning rose with a hush, the kind of light that spilled over rooftops like warm milk, gentle and slow, slipping into corners without hurry. The courtyard smelled faintly of ash and thyme, and the coals from the night before still held a soft warmth, like a memory not quite ready to fade. Callista stepped quietly through the doorway, her feet bare against the cool stone, and let herself stand in the silence for a while. It had become a habit lately, this lingering, this slow noticing of morning before the tasks began. There was something sacred in that pause, something that gave her breath before the weight of the day fully settled on her shoulders. The cloth was folded beneath her mat, and though she hadn't touched it yet that morning, she could feel it. Its presence had begun to shape how she moved through the world, how she listened, how she saw even the smallest details of her life. It wasn't just the act of stitching anymore. It was the awareness it created. The way it taught her to look closely, to feel deeply, to hold things in memory before they slipped through the cracks of routine. She returned to her chores with the usual care, boiling water for the washing, scrubbing a worn clay jar until it glowed with its own history, grinding dried herbs for a mixture her mother used on tired feet. But all through it, she kept noticing the walls, the way the plaster was cracked in certain corners, the faint reddish stain where water sometimes ran from the roof, the places where the stone felt smoother from years of hands brushing by. She realized that, like her cloth, these walls were also a kind of story. Not written in letters or lines, but in texture, in presence, in the way they held the echoes of every laugh, every shout, every moment of silence. That afternoon, while helping her mother rearrange the jars in the storeroom, she found a small bit of charcoal tucked behind a basket. It was likely dropped by Nikandros or her father, used to mark measurements or scratch tallies before being forgotten. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers, feeling the softness of it smear lightly across her skin. Her mother didn't notice, too busy muttering about missing oil jugs and miscounted barley. But Callista slipped the charcoal into her sash, her thoughts already drifting toward the back courtyard wall. It was later, after supper, when she returned to it. The sun had lowered itself behind the western wall and cast everything in a golden haze. She crouched beside the fig tree and pulled the cloth from beneath her tunic, laying it carefully on her lap. But instead of stitching, she turned toward the wall and pressed the charcoal gently to the plaster. At first, she only made small lines, nothing detailed, just marks, a soft arc here, a notch there. She didn't know why. She only knew that her hands seemed to understand something her mind hadn't yet caught up to. And as she drew, she felt it again, that quiet breath of belonging, not to the city beyond the walls or the voices that echoed through the agora, but to the space she occupied. This small corner of Athens, this courtyard, with its leaning tree and its worn stones and its women who remembered in silence. This was her world, and it was enough. Not because it was all she had, but because she was beginning to see it fully, with eyes that no longer looked only for escape, but for meaning. She didn't draw anything recognizable, no figures or faces, just shapes that felt like memory. A curve that echoed the shape of her mother's shoulder when she turned in sleep. A long mark that reminded her of the path she walked each morning to the well. A spiral that held the same quiet energy as Milena's laugh when she wasn't thinking of being heard. The wall held it all, quietly receiving without judgment. When her mother came out to find her, she stood quietly for a moment before speaking. "Do you want to leave something here?" she asked, her voice low. Callista looked at the wall, then at the cloth in her lap, then back to her mother. "Not to leave," she said, "to remember." Her mother stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Then mark it. Let it stay." They didn't speak more. The words had been enough. Later, they would fade into silence again, into the soft rhythms of sleep and breath and the whisper of cloth being folded. But for now, the wall bore the marks of Callista's quiet resistance, and the air held the faint scent of charcoal and thyme, and the stars prepared themselves to appear once more in the sky. It was a morning thick with the scent of dust and olive oil, and the air carried that faint metallic breath that arrives before rain, though no clouds had yet gathered. The city was quieter than usual. A few voices drifted from the street, traders setting up their stalls with less chatter, as if the heaviness in the air had settled over their shoulders too. Callista moved through the house, with a strange sense of awareness, noticing how the reed mat curled slightly at one corner, how the basket of onions sat unevenly near the hearth, how the water jug beside the door gave a faint sound as it cooled, a soft contracting creak, like breath being taken in by the clay itself. Everything felt alert, as if the world were watching her just as closely as she watched it. She found herself returning again and again to the wall where she had marked the charcoal lines the night before. It wasn't the marks themselves that drew her, but the feeling they left behind. The act of placing something visible into the space she occupied, of saying in the simplest possible way, "I was here." Not loudly, not in defiance, but in a language of gesture. The same language her mother had spoken when she hummed as she worked, when she spoke to the bread, when she touched Callista's hand without needing a reason. That morning, her father had left early to attend a meeting near the council chambers, and Nicandros followed not long after, his voice full of casual arrogance as he called over his shoulder for more wine to be stored before the end of the week. The house grew quieter after they left, the silence more complete, more honest. Her mother kneaded dough in the kitchen, her hands moving with habitual rhythm, and Milena sat in the sunlit courtyard with a ball of thread, trying to untangle it with more determination than skill. Callista stepped outside with the water jar, walking toward the well with steady steps. It was a task she'd done 1,000 times, and yet today each step felt different. Not because of the path itself, but because she was present in it. The stones beneath her feet, the rhythm of the jar tapping lightly against her hip, the way her fingers curled around the rope. These things were no longer background. They were part of her understanding. They were part of the world she was learning to speak with, even if no one else heard. At the well, she met another woman, older, her face weathered by sun and years, her hands calloused from work. They exchanged a nod, neither feeling the need for words. They drew water side by side, lifting the jars with similar care, similar patience. As the older woman left, she turned and gave Callista a look. Not curious, not challenging, but recognizing. A kind of brief acknowledgement that passed between women when words would only cheapen what was already understood. Callista held it gently, like a gift placed unexpectedly in her palm. When she returned, she found Milena still wrestling with her thread, now humming tunelessly under her breath. The air was warmer, the kind of warmth that settled between shoulder blades and made the walls exhale a little. Callista set the water jar down beside the basin and stood for a long moment, watching the way the sunlight moved across the floor, chasing itself toward the far wall, where her charcoal lines remained faint but visible. She approached them slowly, her hand brushing the plaster. She didn't draw anything new that day. Instead, she closed her eyes and imagined the wall as a page in her cloth, the thread running through it not in straight lines but in memory. Each mark, each crack in the plaster, each corner that had held laughter or tears, these were stories too. She had begun to see her world not as fixed, but as a kind of tapestry, one constantly being added to, constantly shifting in shape. The loom was not hers to command, but the thread in her hand, this small stretch of voice, of noticing, of care, was hers alone. That evening, she returned to the fig tree, the cloth once again in her lap, the courtyard cloaked in twilight. She stitched slowly, without looking too closely at her hands, letting them move in quiet understanding. The thread was darker this time, a shade that reminded her of the well, of water hidden far beneath the surface. As she worked, she thought of the older woman at the well, of her silent nod, and she stitched that moment into the cloth as a gentle bend in the pattern, a small shift that held the shape of being seen. Her mother joined her again, carrying a bowl of almonds, and sitting without ceremony, her back leaning slightly against the tree's rough trunk. They didn't speak for some time. The almonds were shared quietly, passed back and forth without counting, without comment. Eventually, her mother said, "Sometimes I think the house remembers more than we do." Callista looked up. "What do you mean?" Her mother's eyes drifted toward the wall with the charcoal lines. "The way we walk, the sounds we make, the things we hide and forget. I think the stones keep it, even when we don't." Callista let the thought settle. She imagined the walls listening, not in judgment, but in companionship, bearing witness, holding space. And she stitched a final line for the day, straight, steady, quiet, into her cloth, not as an end, but as a way of saying the story continues. The moon was nearly full that night, and its silver light poured through the courtyard like spilled milk, softening every edge and shadow into something almost dreamlike. Callista sat beneath the fig tree, the leaves overhead whispering softly in the breeze, the cloth resting in her lap like a sleeping child. She had not begun stitching yet. Instead, her fingers moved across the fabric slowly, brushing over each curve and line, tracing the story that only she could read. It had become more than memory now. It was a companion, a quiet conversation that deepened with each thread, that reminded her that her days, though quiet and uncelebrated, were full of meaning. In the house behind her, her mother's footsteps moved gently, arranging things for morning. The familiar sound of clay jars being nudged into line, the soft closing of a cupboard, the sigh of a stool being drawn across the floor. These were the lullabies of her world, unwritten, unmarked, yet repeated so often they became part of the structure itself. And Callista had begun to hear them not as background but as rhythm, as heartbeat. That day had been much like the others, the washing, the sorting, the endless work of hands that seemed always to be preparing or repairing or preserving. But even within that sameness, there had been moments that lingered. A bee trapped in a basket that buzzed and tumbled until Milena gently set it free. Her mother pausing mid-task to press a kiss to Callista's temple without explanation. A neighbor calling across the alleyway, her voice filled with laughter so sudden and joyful it made Callista's heart lift, just hearing it. These were the pieces she carried with her now, not grand, not worthy of a poet's verse, but enough to form the quiet framework of a life. She had begun noticing something else too. The way women looked at each other in the market, not just in greeting but in understanding. The brief touches to the arm, the shared glances that said more than any words. It was a language she had not been taught, but now found herself speaking. A language made of presence, of care, of survival, not as burden, but as knowledge. The kind passed through fingertips rather than scrolls. That afternoon, while sorting olives with her mother, she had asked, without fully meaning to, "Did you ever wish for more?" Her mother had paused, her hands full of briny fruit. "More of what?" "I don't know, more anything." Her mother had looked at her then, really looked, and for a long moment, said nothing. Then she replied, "Sometimes. But wanting does not mean lacking, it means seeing." Those words had stayed with Callista as the sun lowered and the day dimmed, as the house grew quieter and the fig tree once again called to her with its familiar shape. Seeing. That was what she had been learning to do. Not just with her eyes, but with her breath, her hands, her quiet waiting. And so beneath the moonlight she threaded her needle and began to stitch again. The shape that formed was not planned. It bent and curved of its own accord, almost as if the cloth had been waiting for her to find it. It reminded her of a path, narrow, winding, yet steady, like the ones that led through olive groves or between houses where the stone steps dipped from centuries of bare feet. As she stitched, her mind drifted, not in escape, but in presence. Each pass of the needle, another breath, another moment made tangible. She thought of Theano then, the old woman with her cryptic symbols and kind eyes. Callista hadn't seen her in weeks, but her presence remained, stitched into her memory like an old song. She wondered if Theano still marked her clay in secret, if the symbols had changed over the years or remained stubbornly the same. She wondered what it meant to remember things no one asked to hear. Perhaps that was what the cloth had become. A vessel for the stories no one requested, but which insisted on existing anyway. The night deepened. Around her, crickets began their soft music in the grass beyond the walls, and somewhere nearby, a door creaked open and closed again, the sound carried on the wind. Callista finished her line of stitching and held the cloth up to the moonlight. It glowed faintly, the threads catching the silver in small glimmers. She saw the shape of her days, not in events, but in texture. And for a moment, she felt a deep tenderness for the girl she had been. The girl who had once only watched from windows, who had stitched her longing into linen without knowing why. Now she understood. It had never been just about expression. It had been about presence, about making a place for her story where none had been offered, about touching the edge of her own life and saying, softly but surely, I am here. And so she folded the cloth again, cradled it gently, and leaned back against the trunk of the fig tree. The leaves rustled above her like pages being turned. And as her eyes drifted toward the stars, she felt for the first time that the world did not need to shout to remember her. It only needed to witness. A soft rumble stirred the early morning air, not loud enough to startle, but low and steady like a thought forming far off in the distance. Callista awoke before the others, her body attuned now to small changes in the world around her. The light outside was heavy with grey, as if the sky itself had wrapped a blanket around the sun. She lay still for a moment beneath her linen cover, listening. The sound of a single bird cut through the stillness, sharp and curious, followed by the faint sigh of wind through fig leaves. There was no rain yet, only the scent of it lingering in the corners of the air, promising to arrive when it pleased, indifferent to the rhythm of the household below. She rose quietly and stepped into the courtyard, where the stones still held the memory of night's coolness. The wall stood as she had left it, her charcoal lines softened by time, but still clear enough to feel familiar. The cloth too had remained safe beneath her sleeping mat, though she carried it now more often in her hands than hidden away. It had become something of an extension of herself, like a part of her thoughts that needed to exist outside her mind in order to breathe. As she sat once more beneath the fig tree, she felt the wind begin to lift gently around her, curling through the open arches and pulling tiny bits of dust into the air. Her fingers moved across the cloth without urgency. She wasn't stitching yet, just listening to the morning, to herself, to the silence between thunder rolls. There was something sacred in that waiting, something that made her feel held, even if by nothing she could see. She thought of her mother's words, of the house remembering things in its walls, and she wondered if the sky did the same, carrying the weight of unspoken prayers, of stories never shared, of tears shed into the soil without witness. Maybe her cloth was not the only record. Maybe everything around her was remembering too. And in this thought, she found a peace she could not quite name. The first drops fell like whispers against the stone, barely audible but distinct enough to make her pause mid-breath. Callista looked up as the wind curled around her ankles, lifting the hem of her tunic and sending small spirals of dust into the corners of the courtyard. The sky had dimmed into a smooth sheet of grey, and the sound of the rain deepened, a slow patter against leaves and rooftops, steady but never urgent. It was a rain that didn't seek attention, the kind that crept in quietly and stayed longer than expected, wrapping the world in its cool arms. She remained where she was, beneath the fig tree, her cloth carefully tucked beneath her shawl to protect it from the damp. The rain didn't touch her directly, but its presence was all around, softening the edges of things, blurring the lines between sound and silence. It felt like the kind of day meant for remembering, for sinking into thought, for letting go of the thin layers that usually shielded her mind from its own depths. She breathed in the scent of wet soil and olive bark, letting it fill her slowly. Inside, the usual movements of the household had slowed. Milena was curled on a mat with a piece of old parchment and a blunt bit of charcoal, drawing strange shapes that had no meaning but amused her endlessly. Their mother moved with less urgency, her hands folding and refolding cloth, as though she were unsure what task to choose next. The rain did that sometimes. It turned the day inward, made space for thoughts to rise, for memories to surface gently without pushing. Callista stayed outside longer than usual, drawn not by the need to escape, but by the quiet comfort of the moment. She watched the raindrops gather on the leaves above, each one catching a hint of light before slipping free. There was a stillness in it, a kindness almost, as if the world itself was being allowed to breathe more deeply. And as she listened to the rain tracing soft rhythms across the stones, she felt something inside her settle again, the way thread falls naturally into place when tension eases from the hand. The rain slowed just before the sun began its descent, and a thin light pushed through the clouds like a reluctant guest, casting long silver shadows across the courtyard stones. Callista remained still, her back resting against the cool bark of the fig tree, her shawl drawn around her shoulders, though the air was no longer cold. Her fingers idly turned the cloth in her lap, brushing over familiar lines, revisiting the quiet landmarks of days past. The stitching had become less of a task and more like breathing, something her hands knew how to do, even when her mind wandered elsewhere. She had been thinking about the silence, not the comfortable kind that settled between her and her mother or filled the early morning air before anyone woke, but the deeper kind, the one that hung between her life and the city beyond the gate. The silence that seemed to rise whenever she tried to imagine herself anywhere beyond this courtyard, this rhythm of water and bread and thread. There were no maps for her, no paths worn into the earth by women like her, not outside the domestic walls anyway. And she wondered if perhaps that was why she clung so tightly to the cloth, because it was something of her own making, something she could follow. Her needle paused at a point where the thread had knotted. She held it up, inspecting the small tangle, and smiled faintly at how it mirrored her thoughts. Some knots could be undone with patience. Others had to be worked into the pattern, hidden, accepted. she chose not to fight this one. Instead, she adjusted her path and began a new line, one that curved slightly to accommodate the imperfection. A voice called softly from inside, her mother, asking about the lentils. Callista answered without rising, her tone gentle, and then returned her gaze to the sky. The clouds had begun to break apart, revealing slivers of blue that glowed like quiet promises. The storm had passed not with fury, but with softness, and as always, it had left things quieter, cleaner. And Callista, wrapped in the hush of wet stone and thread, felt something in her also beginning to clear. By the time twilight reached the rooftops, the air had taken on that gentle weight that comes after rain, as if the earth itself was settling into its own breath. The sky no longer pressed down with grey, but instead stretched open, touched at the edges with the faded colour of apricots and dusty lilac. Callista stood near the basin, rinsing the last of the clay from her hands after helping her mother rub oil into the jars, and watched as the water rippled gently, reflecting the first star pricking through the sky above. Her cloth rested folded near the fig tree, untouched since the knot had forced her to change direction. It was not avoidance, it was waiting. There were times when the cloth asked to be left alone, as though it too needed to rest from the weight of memory. She understood that now. The stitching was not just a task of the hands, but of the heart, and sometimes even the heart needs a pause. Milena came out with a small loaf, still warm, and broke it in two without a word, handing half to her. They sat beside each other on the edge of the courtyard, feet dangling just above the garden's outer path. The silence between them was easy, filled only with the soft sounds of chewing and the occasional distant bark of a street dog. Milena leaned her head against Callista's shoulder, not in tiredness, but in comfort. A wordless thank you for something unnamed. Callista rested her cheek lightly on her sister's hair and listened to the soft rustle of olive branches in the distance. There was something healing in the way the world quieted itself after rain. The dust settled, the trees seemed less burdened. Even the city beyond the walls seemed to exhale. She thought again of her mother's belief that walls remembered, and it made her wonder whether the rain helped the walls forget just a little, giving them room to breathe before the next set of memories pressed in. She would stitch again soon, perhaps tomorrow, but tonight she simply listened to the rain retreating, to her sister's breath, to the soft rhythm of a world that kept turning gently, with or without witness. The following morning was one of those soft awakenings, the kind where the air is already warm but not yet heavy, and the first bird calls come like old friends returning to familiar branches. Callista woke slowly, not startled by any sound or urgent thought, but simply because her body had rested long enough. She lay still for a moment beneath her light blanket, eyes fixed on the thatched ceiling above, watching as light filtered through in thin golden ribbons. Somewhere nearby, a spoon clinked against a pot, and her mother's low humming threaded itself through the quiet. When she rose and stepped into the courtyard, the stones were already sun-kissed, and a few damp spots from the previous rain still lingered in the crevices, darker in colour, holding on. She knelt near the fig tree without speaking, her cloth beside her, untouched since the evening before. There was no rush, no pressing task pulling her in another direction. The morning felt suspended like a held breath, and she let herself simply be there, listening, breathing, watching, the way the light curled around the edges of the garden. She noticed that the soil beneath the fig tree had darkened with the rain, and she ran her fingers through it gently. The scent rose up, rich and earthen, full of the scent of life and decay braided together. A familiar smell, and yet every time it surprised her with how deeply it reached. That soil had held the roots of this tree for as long as she could remember. It had drunk years of rain, heard every whisper, every silence, caught crumbs of bread, drops of wine, even tears. It knew them, she thought, in a way no scroll or scribe ever would. Callista dug a little deeper, just with her fingertips, and uncovered a small, smooth stone, rounded by time. It was nothing special, just a stone. But it had been there all along, waiting beneath the surface. She turned it over in her hand, slowly, brushing off the damp earth, and placed it beside her cloth. It felt right, like it belonged there. A reminder that not all things meant to be part of our story had yet surfaced. She didn't begin stitching just yet. Instead, she sat quietly with the cloth, the stone, and the morning, letting the world move gently around her. As the morning stretched forward, the sounds of the neighborhood began to return, the faint murmur of footsteps outside the wall, the rhythmic tapping of a broom against stone, the soft bleating of a goat being coaxed into motion. The quiet that had blanketed the world after the rain was thinning now, not lost, but folded gently beneath the returning rhythm of daily life. Callista remained where she was, near the fig tree, her fingers lightly tracing the stone she'd unearthed, the cloth resting beside it like an old friend still waking from sleep. Her mother stepped into the courtyard with a bowl of olives and paused at the sight of her daughter, sitting so still, so quiet. But she said nothing. Instead, she set the bowl near the hearth and turned away, her silence a kind of blessing, a gentle agreement not to interrupt something that didn't need to be explained. Callista was grateful for that. She had grown to treasure these unspoken understandings, the ones that made her feel known without having to shape words around the feeling. Eventually, she lifted the cloth into her lap, her hands moving without instruction. She threaded the needle carefully and brought it to the fabric with a steadiness that surprised even her. There was no hesitation, only presence. The thread passed through the cloth with the softest whisper, pulling behind it a line of meaning that only she would ever fully understand. It was a new line, curving gently, then doubling back, as though it was searching for something just beyond reach. She thought again of the stone, how it had waited beneath the soil, silent and still, until her fingers found it. That quiet waiting felt familiar. It echoed something in her own chest, something that had no shape yet, but was slowly finding form in the act of stitching. Maybe the cloth wasn't about remembering after all. Maybe it was about becoming. A place where she could trace the shape of her own unfolding, thread by thread, without needing permission or recognition. The sun rose higher, and the courtyard warmed, but Callista stayed where she was, the cloth steady in her lap, her heart steady in its rhythm, becoming quietly. By midday, the scent of baked barley bread drifted from the kitchen, blending with the warm air and the quiet rustling of olive branches beyond the courtyard wall. The house had settled into its usual rhythm, but Callista remained by the fig tree, her cloth spread across her lap like a map only she could read. The thread moved steadily through her fingers, not rushed, not forced. It followed a path she did not plan, one that curved and dipped and doubled back, just as her thoughts had done over these past weeks. Her world had not changed. And yet, she could feel something within herself shifting like a tide, slowly pulling away from the shore. She stitched in long, thoughtful motions, each pass through the linen leaving behind a softness, a whisper of herself woven into the fabric. It no longer felt like something she was making, for someone else to see. It was not decoration. It was not offering. It was breath. A record not of events, but of being. As the cloth grew heavier with thread, it also became lighter in her hands, as if some quiet burden she had carried for years had slowly begun to move out of her, thread by thread, thought by thought. She paused just for a moment to lift her face toward the light. The fig leaves shimmered in that early afternoon way, not quite still, not quite dancing. Somewhere above, a dove cooed lazily from a rooftop, its call rising and falling like a lullaby. It reminded her of a day long ago when she had been no older than Milena, lying in this very courtyard while her mother tended the herbs. She had watched that same tree back then, wondering if the leaves spoke to each other when no one was listening. That child was still within her, she realized, watching, wondering, never entirely gone. A familiar voice called from beyond the courtyard wall. It was Anthe, their neighbour, asking after her mother's lentil stew and offering a few dried figs in exchange for more of the bay leaves her mother kept so perfectly dried. Callista smiled quietly. The exchange of goods was not always about need. Often, it was a way of touching each other's lives, a form of care passed back and forth like shared breath. She rose and handed the bay leaves through the gate, offering a soft word of thanks and receiving the figs with gentle fingers. Anthe gave her a knowing smile, not just for the trade, but for something more, something unspoken. That smile stayed with her long after the woman had walked away. Returning to her place beneath the tree, she let her gaze drift across the courtyard. Everything she knew lived within these walls, and yet each day she saw it more clearly, more deeply. The wear on the doorstep, where her father's sandals always paused, the small dent in the edge of the basin where her mother once dropped a clay cup, the single cracked tile that no one ever bothered to replace. These were not flaws. They were memories folded into the skin of the home. Evidence that life had been lived here, fully, if quietly. She picked up the stone she had unearthed the day before, turning it over in her hand again. It had dried now, its smooth surface warmed by the sun. She held it against the cloth for a moment, unsure what she meant by it, only knowing that it belonged there, if not as part of the stitching, then as part of the story. Some things could not be sewn into fabric. They had to be felt, held, witnessed. And as she resumed her stitching, she thought about how long it had taken her to understand that her life mattered, even in the absence of grand events. That to be a woman in Athens was to be marked by silence, by service, by boundaries drawn without permission, but within those boundaries there was still breath, still thought, still the choosing of when to speak and when to hold still. She had chosen to remember, to witness, to hold thread and cloth and memory together in a form that might never leave the courtyard, but would always remain with her. The thread curved one last time before she set her needle down and exhaled. The sky had changed again, the color deepening toward a soft bronze, shadows lengthening with the promise of evening. She leaned back against the fig tree, cloth in hand, and let her eyes close. There was no need to hurry. The story she was telling had waited this long to be heard. It could wait just a little longer as the world hushed once again around her. The evening settled into the courtyard like a shawl, soft and familiar, draping itself over the stones and the edges of the fig tree's branches. The scent of cooling earth mingled with the last wisps of smoke from the hearth, and the wind, now only a whisper, moved through the leaves with the kind of sound that made one believe the trees might truly be speaking to each other. Callista sat still, her body relaxed but alert, the weight of the cloth resting on her knees like a sleeping animal. She hadn't stitched in some time now. The thread had been set aside not because the story had ended, but because the silence had asked for space. And she had learned to listen when silence asked for anything. She watched her sister circle the edge of the courtyard, playing some quiet game of her own making, tracing a pattern with her toe through the faint dust left by the earlier breeze. Milena paused now and then to glance toward her, as if checking to see if she still had her attention, and Callista would smile softly, nod, then return her gaze to the wall where her charcoal marks had faded just slightly with the passing days. It comforted her to know they were still visible. Even fading lines could remember. Her mother moved in the kitchen behind her, preparing lentils again, the smell rich and simple and full of familiarity. That scent had followed Callista through every season of her life, and tonight it felt more like home than ever. There was something about the way ordinary moments returned to her now with new shape, how each detail of her day seemed threaded with deeper color since she began to see her life as a pattern rather than a waiting room. Not a holding place, but a place already full, already whole. She thought of the stories the men told in the Agora, of wars and alliances, of gods and glories, and how none of them included women like her. None of them described the quiet power of knowing the weight of grain in your palm or the memory carried in a jar of oil passed down from one season to the next. They did not speak of how a home was kept alive not by voice or decree, but by the steady, unnoticed hands that prepared and preserved and provided. Callista didn't need their stories anymore. She had found her own. She picked up the cloth once more, holding it in the waning light. The stitched lines shimmered faintly in the golden hues of the setting sun, not because the thread was fine, but because it had caught something of her breath, her hope, her quiet resistance. Every curve and bend was a sentence written in softness, a memory shaped in rhythm. She began again, her fingers moving slowly, pulling the needle through with care, not needing speed or urgency. Each stitch was a continuation of all that had come before, not just in the cloth, but in her life. In the lives of the women who had come before her, whose names were forgotten, whose hands had once moved the same way. And as she stitched, she thought of Theano again, of the strange symbols and the old woman's eyes that seemed to see both past and future all at once. She wondered where Theano was now, whether she still marked clay with her silent messages or had moved on to other forms of remembering. The thought made her smile. Not everyone needed to see the marks for them to matter. Sometimes it was enough that they existed at all. When the stitching line reached the edge of the cloth, Callista paused and looked up at the sky. The stars were beginning to reveal themselves, timidly at first, then with more confidence as the light faded. She felt her own breath slow to match the stillness around her. There was something sacred in this time of day, just as the world shifted from one shape to another. A moment suspended between the done and the not yet, when everything held its breath in quiet acknowledgement of what had been and what would come. She folded the cloth carefully and placed it beside her, her fingers lingering on the fabric, as if to thank it for what it had become. Milena had stopped her game now and sat nearby, watching the stars as they blinked into place. Her hair was a tangle, her knees dusty, her face calm. Callista reached over and gently smoothed a strand from her forehead. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. The pattern had already spoken. Night deepened around them, but the warmth of the courtyard lingered like an embrace that refused to let go. The fig tree cast soft shadows on the stone, its leaves barely moving now, heavy with the stillness that comes only after long reflection. Callista stayed seated, her hands resting in her lap, the folded cloth beside her catching the moonlight like a pool of captured thought. The sky above had filled with stars, each one flickering like an old song returned from memory. She felt no urgency to move, no need to mark the hour or prepare for the next day. In this moment, she was enough. The house behind her, the tree above, the breath beside her where Milena leaned silently. All of it formed a kind of cocoon, one woven from familiarity and a gentle knowing that could never be put into words. She had long accepted that her life would not be written in scrolls, that her name would not echo in stone forums or be praised by poets in marble halls. But that was not sorrow anymore, it was clarity. The women around her, the ones who cooked and stitched and listened and remembered, they were not meant to vanish simply because they were not named. They had never been invisible, not truly. They had simply lived in the margins, where stories whispered instead of shouted, where hands spoke more truth than mouths ever could. And Callista, with her thread and her quiet heart, had begun to hear those stories, not just in the lives around her, but in the cloth itself, in the grain of the wood, in the rhythms of daily life that stretched back further than she could know. She looked at Milena then, at the young face turned upward to the sky, eyes wide, taking it all in as if it might disappear. And in her, Callista saw the beginning again. A fresh thread waiting to be guided gently through the loom of a world that might never make space for her willingly, but that could not deny her presence either. The story, she realized, was not just in the telling. It was in the choosing to live it, fully, quietly, and with open eyes. Later, as the stars held steady and the air cooled around them, Callista rose slowly and gathered the cloth in her arms. It was complete now, not in the sense that every space was filled, but in the way that stories are when they've said what they needed to. She pressed it against her chest for a long moment, letting its weight settle into her like the closing of a long breath. In the stillness, she could feel everything it held, moments not spoken, fears faced in silence, the tenderness of care that asked for nothing in return. She didn't need to show it to anyone. That had never been its purpose. It had always been about listening, about witnessing the shape of a life that was never meant to be loud. She placed the cloth in her small chest and folded the lid down with care. Then, turning back toward the courtyard, she paused and looked once more at the fig tree, its branches resting quietly above the world it had watched for years. A small smile found her lips, and with it, the knowledge that she had carved her own space into the stillness. And it would remain, even in the silence,